Hi, I'm Yakov Katz, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. And as it is often in this country, things move at a very swift and quick pace. And it's difficult to keep up with exactly where things stand, whether it's on the negotiations for potential ceasefire with Hamas in Gaza and the possible release of the hostages who have been languishing for just way far too long inside the Hamas terror dungeons in Gaza and wait for the day that they can come home, whether it is to the end of the war and what that will mean and what that day after will look like, or whether it is about Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition, whether it will survive. There will be a new election. What does it mean that the Haredi Party, United Torah Judaism, pulled out of the coalition on Monday night? And does it mean now that the clock is ticking down towards the end of Netanyahu's longest government? And if we are heading to a new election, and when will that be? And then, of course, there's the question of what happened last week in Washington, which we still don't really know, although officials who I speak to say it was amazing, it was great, everything went well, great understandings. But the public still is in the dark of whether a new understanding was reached between Netanyahu and Trump, whether it was on Iran, it was on Syria, it was on the Abraham Accords expansion, or on the ceasefire, which everybody thought was about to happen. And still, days after he returned to Israel on Friday, a breakthrough does not seem to be there. So to break all of this down and probably ask more questions than provide answers, I'm joined by my two esteemed JPPI colleagues. Next to me in the same room for a change is Professor Gil Troy. And on the screen joining us from far away in Tel Aviv is Shmuel Rosner. So Gil, I know you don't want to really talk much about this because we don't know too much of what's happening, but I think you'll probably agree with me that there was a feeling, at least when Netanyahu was in Washington in the beginning, that a deal is coming at any moment. And people were waiting with great anticipation for that prospect and that possibility. But then he returned to Israel on Friday, still no deal. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, still no deal. And it doesn't look like it's happening anytime soon. I mean, there's a sense of disappointment to some extent.
Well, I just want to disagree with you a little bit because there's one thing we definitely know. The sun is shining. And there's a certain kind of weird normalcy in the country. People flipped back from the Iran war in a remarkable way. And what's surprising, once again, we see in Israel is this disconnect between the completely confusing headlines and just sort of like the power of what we call in Hebrew the shigra, the routine, even during the summer months. But yes, you know, my pro-Netanyahu friends are all talking about Marine One. All talking about the fact that Trump let Bibi, come through a special entrance into the White House and gave him a ride on the presidential helicopter, and in the Hebrew would be lefragen, really gave him a lot of positive reinforcement. But what that actually means, we're not sure. And to me, the two biggest questions, as you say, first of all, Iran, the hope. And what everybody's doing is because they're reading all these positive tea leaves, they're deciding, therefore, that Netanyahu and Trump came to an agreement whereby if Iran starts trying to return to its nuclear program, and I hope also its ballistic missiles program, that the United States will allow Israel to do what it needs to do, which means thwart it, because it cannot be allowed to return to the position it had in June 11th. And the second question, of course, is the hostages and the ceasefire. We should add one more thing, which is that we lost 3 soldiers yesterday. Yep. We lost 5 soldiers, I think, Friday. That I think there are 40 soldiers who have died in the last month and a half, 2 months. And how that death toll plays out with the hostages goes in 2 different directions. One, everybody's talking about the 50 hostages when we're really talking about 20 live hostages. How do you balance 40 dead soldiers and 9 to 10 million Israelis and 1,200 dead on October 7th, and almost, I think we're at 893 soldiers who have already died. What's the significance of their deaths vis-a-vis the hostages? So you're hearing some voices saying their life needs meaning. Their sacrifice needs meaning, and therefore we can't give in so quickly. You also have the dimension where people saying, wait a minute, is a deal with the hostages where you have 2 and then 8, or 8 and then 2 and then 10? And they're using the ugly Holocaust term selektia. How does that play out? And then there are those just saying deal, deal, deal. So even what people want is very unclear.
I mean, I'll just say, though, that on the question of what soldiers die for, which really is a legitimate question today, because you talk to anyone in the army, it's unclear what they're fighting. Yes, there are Hamas fighters, there's guerrilla warfare, But if the objective is the hostages, then there's a legitimate question to ask, are these lives worth sacrificing for the hostages? But the goal is not the hostages, for this government at least. And we'll talk about that in a moment, because there was a big New York Times article that did come out and kind of point an accusatory finger at Netanyahu, saying that he's prolonging the war, and he's taken that quite personally. And there was a video that he put out on Monday night where he kind of tried to push back against what he claimed were the lies of the media. But I do want to touch on, Shmuel, this issue that really we do go back and forth about right now within Israel, of what is it that we are fighting for? And is it that we're fighting for the hostages? Is it that we're fighting for to defeat Hamas, which people don't really know what that means anymore? And there's all these plans that keep coming up, from the Gaza Humanitarian City to the Gaza Humanitarian Fund to the Morag corridor, which is reminiscent of the old Netzarim corridor and the Philadelphia corridor. At the end of the day, I think Gaza is just going to be a bunch of corridors. It's like hallways, throughout Gaza. What is it that Israel's doing there right now? And does the public understand what the purpose is of this operation?
Well, the formal objectives of the war never changed. Israel started the war by putting together two main goals. One is the return of all the hostages, and the other is the uproot of Hamas in Gaza. Never will we return to the situation of pre-war Gaza. Hamas can no longer be there, can no longer be the ruling party. I think the goals are still the same goals, and the only question that the Israeli public is somewhat confused about is whether these two goals are realistic, whether they can be achieved together, and whether either of them is realistic at the current situation. And I'll explain. Can we return all the hostages while stating that we want to get rid of Hamas? What's the incentive for Hamas to hand the hostages back if they know that we are going to keep fighting them until they are uprooted? So for them, the incentive is to keep the hostages for as long as necessary until Israel gives up on the hope of uprooting them, namely the leadership of Hamas. On the other hand, many in Israel currently believe that the goal of uprooting Hamas is, while worthy, is not realistic. They don't think that the Israeli government has a clear plan for achieving its goals. If there's a plan, it's a plan that will take many years and a lot of sacrifice. And when we see Israel beginning to drag its feet in the Gaza mud, it's summertime now, so there's no mud. There's mostly dust. But when we see Israel dragging its feet in Gaza, Israelis do begin to ask themselves, why do we sacrifice soldiers on a daily basis when the goal that we all want to achieve? It's not as if Israelis suddenly change their mind and say, we don't care, let Hamas stay. No, we want to get rid of Hamas. We do not want to see Hamas ruling Gaza. But if Israelis don't see a realistic path to achieving such goal, many of them say, well, we can't get it now. We can't get what we want on this front. Let's at least get the hostages back and stay to fight Hamas another day.
And I think that that's the true challenge, definitely, of this government, right? Which is it has never really been able to articulate a plan of what it wants to see happen. And to me, it's pretty amazing, I think, that Donald Trump still stands with Netanyahu to a large extent, right? We didn't see daylight or any tension in that visit. What we saw were at least two meetings that the two had. There was that dinner where the prime minister was joined also by his wife, but then there was the meeting the next day in the Oval Office. Netanyahu knows how to play Trump quite well, right? He brought him the letter of recommendation for the Nobel Peace Prize, which Trump seemed to like. The next day, he brought him a mezuzah shaped as a B-2 bomber made out of shrapnel from an Iranian missile. And when I watched that, I thought it was nice, but then I said to myself, the Qataris give the guy an airplane, we give him a mezuzah shaped as an airplane, right? So, it's a bit different. But what did you see there, Gil, in those meetings, or just in the vibe, in the atmosphere of what was going on? Because this was the post-terrific, amazing, we obliterated Iran visit. What was your sense as somebody who's long watched that relationship between prime ministers and presidents?
The Nobel Prize nomination was a genius move because for the cost of a piece of paper, I think it almost balanced the Qatari plane. And the truth is that any political leader, any judge, any academic can make the nomination. I've nominated people, I've nominated institutions, and you can still see on their websites, nominated for a Nobel Prize, and they don't say by some no-name academic. But it was a way of saying what was clever about it, and it was kind of his response to Trump's saying, and I think one of the most significant things that was said in the build-up to the meeting was Trump saying 3 times that Israel has to stop persecuting, that's his word, Netanyahu, that the prosecution has to end. Mm-hmm. And what that showed was Trump identifying with Netanyahu. Trump is a primal politician.
I mean, by the way, with that said, he did come out with a series of tweets this week also in favor or support of Bolsonaro in Brazil. So it seems like if you're a friend to Trump and you're indicted,
right?
He's coming to help you.
Right, but especially if we go back to a month ago when everybody was saying, "Oh, there's this rupture," the tension between the United States and Israel and between Bibi and Trump has never been so great. And what's interesting is many people have said that there isn't necessarily a great personality chemistry between the two, but somehow or other they now see themselves very much in the same boat. They see themselves very much as world historic leaders. What's interesting is that Trump, who's a mercurial character, who I think when he came into office wanted to just say peace, 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 is now seeing that in order to kind of put his stamp on world history, and that's very important to him, sometimes a little bit of military action, especially the kind of military action he did in Iran, which was, 25 minutes of action and weeks and weeks of glory, is exactly the kind of balance that Trump wants. So I think all those tea leaves suggest that the chemistry between them was very good, and they were very much aligned personally and in terms of their broader ambitions. How they achieve the ambitions is always the question.
By the way, I mean, you say the weeks of glory. I saw him speak somewhere yesterday where he was talking about how the B-2 bombers flew into the most dangerous skies in the world and did what they did. Now, I mean, just 2 things that are interesting to point out. A, B-2 bombers are stealth, right? So they can't be detected by the Iranian, radar and then be potentially fired at. Although even if they could, Israel had destroyed pretty much all of the air defense systems of Iran, paving the way for the B-2 bombers. So the most dangerous skies was a bit of an exaggeration, but that is the kind of man that he is.
Never let facts get in the way of a good story.
No, of course. Shmuel, and I know that as a journalist, trust me, but
I know that as a historian.
Yeah.
No, I'm just
Shmuel, when we look at Gaza, and it does seem that Netanyahu wants this over. Or at least he wants a ceasefire. He wants to bring back the hostages. We'll talk about the politics in a moment, but the whole conversation in Israel is about what we call Tzir Morag, the Morag corridor, which is down south. It's about 12, 13 kilometers long. It separates the south of Gaza from the rest of Gaza. It's very reminiscent of what we called at the time the Netzarim corridor, which is up in the north. Both Morag and Netzarim are settlements that Israel used to hold in Gaza before the disengagement when we pulled out back in 2005. The Netzarim corridor, after the ceasefire back in January, about 100,000 Palestinians went back to the north. Among them, the IDF presumes there's about 10,000 Hamas guys. So if one day Israel is going to want to go back there, it's going to have to clear out that area. So here they say if we keep the Morag corridor, we can create this Gaza humanitarian city or zone in the south of Gaza in the area of Rafah and be able to filter it out, basically. It's a way to filter. Now, Yair Lapid comes out and says, suddenly Morag is the Sela Kiyumenu, is the cornerstone of our existence. I mean, is it real in your analysis of the need, because there are military people who say, no, we have to keep a presence in the perimeter. We can't pull out completely from Gaza like Hamas wants. I do hear that argument. On the other hand, another holding a line is what's going to make Israel more, that's going to keep us from the October 7th. I mean, there's next October 7th, there's so much more that would need to happen. Is this politics or is this policy?
No, I don't think it is just politics. Certainly, when politicians are involved, there's always politics involved. So you must mix in some measure of politics when you deal with political leaders. But by and large, it goes back to what I said earlier. It's the question of whether Israel aims to control the Gaza Strip and in what way, and whether Israel is still hoping to uproot Hamas in a more determined, systematic way. If you believe that the job is not yet done, and that the IDF still needs to be there, and that there must be a way for the IDF to filter out people or to have raids, immediate raids into certain areas, etc., then you need to keep some roads within Gaza or some perimeters within Gaza that Israel can continuously control and use as a launching pad for more attacks or more operations or more creative ideas that aim to deal with the remnants of Hamas that are still there. If you, on the other hand, believe that Israel did what it can do for a reasonable price, and it's a significant sacrifice at this point, and that it is time for Israel to pull back and say, okay, we did what we did, the Gaza Strip is in ruins, we will keep coming back if necessary to make sure that Hamas does not gain more power, but we are willing to live with some remnants of Hamas still walking around saying they survived the war. If that's the case, then you ought to get the hostages back, declare victory and pull out of the region. So I think the government is still hoping to get something more tangible that they can present as real achievement to the Israeli public and to the region in Gaza, while many other Israelis are at this point content to live with the possibility of, what we have is what we have. We cannot achieve more. We lost the war long ago on October 7th. We could do as much as we did up until now, but hoping that we can get rid of the last person standing from Hamas before we leave is not a realistic plan. And since we have to keep our soldiers there and sacrifice young lives almost every morning, that's not a reasonable price to pay.
It also has to be said that polls show, including ones that we've been running at JPPI, but there's also one Saturday night on I think Channel 12 News, that showed that the vast majority of Israelis, right, 70-something%, want this war over and want to get back the hostages and want it to end.
It does depend to some degree on the way you phrase the question. In our survey, we specifically said, end the war while Hamas is still in power, and there's still a majority, but it's a much smaller majority. It's 50-something% and not 70-something%. So the question of whether you agree to live with the idea that Hamas is still standing, limping, barely standing, but there is still Hamas presence in Gaza, or you say, no, this is a situation I'm not willing to live with. That's the core question the Israeli public must decide. And the Israeli government, at least at this point, tilts towards the no compromise position. And that's why we see this negotiation with Hamas dragging on.
If I can add one thing, there is, I think, what I call the Zamir factor, which is the new chief of staff seems to have a certain credibility with the public and with the army, that the old Chief of Staff, Herzi Halevi, didn't. And I sense a certain diminishment in the public hysteria in the conversation about what's going on, because there's a little bit more confidence in him, and he's at least spoken with a certain crispness about some of the goals of the military, and so there's a little less feeling of we're stuck in another Vietnam or Lebanon.
And I'll just add about Eyal Zamir, he has stood up on a number of times to the government, at least according to leaks that have come out from cabinet meetings, where he said to them, this is not a good plan, or this doesn't make sense, or on the humanitarian city in Gaza, this will cost a fortune and the military will end up having to control it, or about the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, those different compounds where they give out the humanitarian aid, where he said, I don't want the soldiers to do it, and got into a big clash with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir within the cabinet. So he has stood his ground, interestingly.
Which to some Israelis proves that the problem was never the chief of the IDF. It was always the unrealistic demands of government officials. You know, if the new IDF chief of staff that they installed
is telling them he was chosen by them, exactly.
Yeah, he's telling them the same thing that they heard from his predecessor, then the problem is with them and not with him.
And by the way, I mean, that ties into another question that we often ask in our polls, right? Trust in the IDF versus trust in the government. And
no comparison.
Even with the failures of October 7th and everything, the trust in the senior military command is by much higher. I do want to shift gears for a moment and move to the politics, because we can't ignore the fact Netanyahu is in that sweet spot that he often likes to be in to some extent, although must be pressured, of course. He's got the Haredim breathing down his neck on the IDF draft law, which still hasn't passed, and they said that the one that was presented Monday night in the Knesset was not good enough, and therefore United Torah Judaism, with both its factions, decided to resign. Shas, for the time being, is still in, but by the time this podcast drops, for all we know, Aryeh Deri has pulled his party also out of the coalition. So the coalition now is down to, I think, just 61, a very thin majority. The Knesset goes on recess basically at the end of next week. So potentially it is possible to pass a bill to disperse the Knesset. They could do that potentially on Wednesday of this week. They could do it next week, but it would be hard to get it through. And they say for the time being that they're not voting to disperse the Knesset. And then on the other side of the political pressure that Netanyahu's under is Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who are saying to Bibi, if you move ahead with this Gaza ceasefire deal and you stop the war, and I do not have guarantees that the war will resume, I will also pull out of the government. So Netanyahu's facing right-wing opposition in his coalition, Haredi opposition in his coalition, opposition from the opposition. He's a bit embattled for a guy who just led what is, I think, in my eyes at least, but to most people, a huge military accomplishment against Iran. And there's not a single moment of, what's the term, of just a break for him.
I'll see you and raise you. And apparently also the polls didn't show a surge of support in the wake of this extraordinary Iran victory. And that I think shows two things. One is the deep tribalism. Even the way you describe it, it's the Haredim, it's the right wing, and then of course there's been the opposition that has been pushing, and so one feels that almost if even this extraordinary success in Iran isn't enough to kind of change the political scheme, what is? And that goes to something you said very early on in the podcast that I want to go to, which is the New York Times article, which, although it came out of the United States of America, is, first of all, the American Jews' Bible, but also has generated headlines here. And if you go through this very long New York Times Magazine article, I think you see two things. One, there's some very good reporting, especially in the first half. And there's this image of Bibi Netanyahu in his pajamas when he's when he's having a little heart procedure, being told that before October 7th, in July, I think it was, 2023, that the security situation is unstable and that he has to do something. And that's a very dramatic scene, and that's actually very well done. By the time you get to the second half, and this gets to the core issue now around the politics of the war, I think it goes from reporting to distorting. And they so minimize any Israeli military accomplishment. They so minimize the string of successes starting in September, with crushing Hezbollah, with Syria collapsing, and then Iran, because they have to make the story about Bibi Netanyahu only wanting to survive the coalition. And one of the other distortions is they keep on talking about this hostage deal, but they never actually specify what's in the deal. And so, yeah, who doesn't want a war to end? Except by sticking it through, and by the way, sticking it to Biden again and again and defying Joe Biden. Bibi Netanyahu delivered some of Israel's greatest victories, and that's where I disagree with you a little bit, Shmuel. Obviously, October 7th was a disaster, and the New York Times keeps on emphasizing that Israel's now unpopular in the world, but I think almost 2 years later, Israel's in a stronger position. The world is safer. The jihadi movement in general has been pulled back. And so in many ways, while we lost the war on the first day, every day since we've won the war and we've changed the map of the Middle East. And you have to give Bibi Netanyahu some of that credit.
You have to, by the way, I mean, just on the New York Times thing, I thought it was also very good reporting. I think, like you said, they played down the success of September 2024. Which is when Israel took on Hezbollah, the pager attack, the elimination of Nasrallah, his successor's successor, the long-range missiles. And basically you have a real battered and beaten Hezbollah today. And that enabled the attack on Iran that has further isolated Hamas in Gaza. If we did not have Hezbollah pushed back, imagine what the war would look like with Hamas in Gaza and what things would look like there. So I just don't know if it was planned to be in that way. That's the question. In other words, I think that Netanyahu might have dragged things out, and then the opportunity presented itself. He, of course, took it. But it wasn't that the strategy on October 8th was, we'll drag till here, we'll do this, we'll move to there. It was much more ad hoc, and that's why I think they played it down, but the overall story was not necessarily faulty in that way.
Bibi's defiance of Biden, which is seen as this great sin, according to the New York Times, was actually the key to ultimately the successes.
Also,
which Biden boasts about.
100%. So Shmuel, looking at the politics though, when you see what the Haredim are doing, are we headed to an election? Your assessment, are they going to go all the way? And is Ben Gvir Smotrich, would they pull out of a coalition? I mean, what's next for Netanyahu? What's next for the country in terms of political stability?
Well, I'm taking a risk here because we have so many moving parts that to tell you now what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 or 5 days is going to be somewhat dangerous. But the fact of the matter is that at the end of next week, the Knesset is going into a long hiatus basically until October.
Yeah.
So both for Netanyahu, for his right-wing partners, for his Haredi partners, the best thing to do now is relax. They all climb these high trees, they all make threats, etc., when they all know that from the end of next week until October, the coalition can survive without a majority. There's no parliament. There's no way for the opposition to topple the government. The Haredis are not saying at this time that they intend to call for new election. They're just pulling out of the coalition. We see Smotrich and Ben Gvir pushing hard for no compromise in the Gaza negotiation. Then again, by the end of next week, Netanyahu's hands are much freer to do as he wishes to do, with the idea that by October, either his partners will have an opportunity to come back and get on board and rejoin the coalition and support him, or that by October they all agree on a date for the new election, which could be, early January or February of 2026. This will only be a short few months before the real time of election. Nobody expected the election to be on October 26 as planned, because elections in Israel always take place.
It's amazing that this government has lasted until now. Right.
That's true. It was assumed that the government will not be able to pass a budget for 2026. which means that by the end of March 2026, we will have to decide on a new time for election, which will be June 26. So instead of June, it'll be February of 26. The first half of 26 seems like a reasonable time for no election. Could it be an earlier time? Yeah, there is still a chance that the coalition will somehow erupt and, collapse, and no election will be called for October or November. But I don't think that's the likely scenario. I think the more likely scenario is election in early 2026, which means that we are gearing towards election season.
Yeah.
That Netanyahu, during the summer, when Netanyahu plans his next moves for the summer, he must take into account the coming election, which means less compromise with the ultra-Orthodox parties. He cannot go to an election while seen by most of the public as someone who compromised with the ultra-Orthodox on exemption for Haredi youngsters, which means that he might want to have a deal in Gaza so that he could come forward to the public and say, we won the war in Syria, Lebanon, Iran. We eliminated most of Hamas, if not all of it, in Gaza. Gaza is in ruins. I ended the war, as I told you I was going to do, and now we can have a new beginning in my next term as prime minister.
Okay. Next time, Shmuel, you should join us. It's nice sitting in the same room. So I want to thank both of you, Gil Troy and Shmuel Rosner. Thank you for joining us. And to our listeners and viewers, thanks for being with us as always. You can find the Jewish People's Podcast on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, website of Times of Israel. We'll be back with another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast.